I arrived in Leiden in 2003. There's a connection with the Religion and Society group behind that as well, because I was still employed in Amsterdam at the time. I had sort of glanced at full professorships earlier. I was still an assistant professor, not an associate one. So when I got to Leiden as a full professor in the Anthropology of Africa, I basically jumped one rank, jumped over one rank and ended up in the highest one available in the Dutch system. But it had a connection with religion and society because Patricia Speyer, the editor of the Board of Fetishism book, had preceded me there, also as an area studies focused anthropology professor. She was the professor of Indonesia, I became the professor of Africa, and in that capacity I succeeded Peter Schiere, who had left Leiden I think 2 years earlier. Fed up, although I'm not the one to speak in his behalf, I think he was fed up by especially the demands that the university administration put on him, and he had been quite often, on the receiving end of such intrusions because he was for a long time the chair of the department. So on the one hand, I was extremely proud of stepping in his footsteps and in the footsteps of some other illustrious predecessors like Adam Cooper, for example. At the same time that I was aware, as everyone at that time was made aware, that being a full professor was not, by definition, a nice job. And I think that has been very true of my own career. Neoliberal university management is not something I'd like to dwell upon. It's also something that I didn't like doing, although I don't think I was bad at it. But I distinctly remember that, especially my first 7 years, I guess, 6 or 7 years, were marked by sleepless nights and worries about, what was asked for me, worries about the department, which was always regarded by, or at least for a long time, was regarded by the deans of the Faculty of Social Sciences as some kind of vreemdkörper that didn't contribute to actual social science because it was actually a humanities discipline. And, we until recently, it was rare that we were made to feel at home in the faculty. I should say that did change when I became the scientific director of the institute in 2009. I did 1.5 year interim earlier when Patricia was abroad. But I fulfilled different other, administrative roles, director of research, director of education. I, in fact, set up, together with my colleague Franklin Chonsy-Fat, the whole new BA-MA structure that was then ordained through European cooperation, right, the EU regulations for a new university system that was meant to make university programs exchangeable between different countries. So German students could do a BA in Germany and then join an MA in the Netherlands, for example. We first sort of set up that program. And I think I'll come back to that program later on. But my great luck when I became scientific director was that Philip Spinhoven was a psychologist, had just become the new dean, And he never showed any disdain towards our institute, or at least rarely. And he also held some of the other people who sometimes did in check. And I actually had 3 years of really positive and productive collaboration with him, which goes back to an earlier theme, because it also involved the Faculty of Archaeology. Of course, by this time, after about 3 years having worked in Çatalhöyük, I was becoming a minor celebrity among Leiden archaeologists, because nobody who works in Çatalhöyük can be anything bad, right? You must be someone if you're invited to do that. Ian Hodder has a huge reputation worldwide. So the Leiden archaeologists started to become interested in this anthropologist in the neighborhood. And I was involved in a number of issues, not least because I was I could cooperate very well. I was also quite fond of the dean of the Faculty of Archaeology, Willem Willems, who was also a major figure in international organizations that had to do with heritage. Right? As an archaeologist, it's quite logical. He worked with ICOMOS, had a lot to do with organizations at the UNESCO level and things like that. So it started to tally with some of the work I did with Lynn Mescal and the archaeologists in our circles. So for a while, because archaeology also felt threatened by, it's a small faculty, and neoliberal university establishment don't like small. They want big because they think that's more manageable, which I think they think wrong, but anyway, that's another story. What we tried to do was bring the Faculty of Archaeology into the Faculty of Social Sciences, so that actually anthropology and archaeology could team up and form a really strong block within that faculty, at the same time keeping, 1 foot in another identity as a humanities discipline or as a much more strictly scientific discipline, which some of the psychologists would like, who were very much into neurology and hard stuff, hard experimental stuff. Unfortunately, it failed. Also because the political situation in the university didn't really work out. But I have really good memories of working together at the administrative level there. So it wasn't all bad. But I distinctly remember, and especially also in the years afterwards, that I personally experienced most of the neoliberal university management initiatives from our faculty in particular, but also sometimes from the central board of the university as intrusions not based on much respect for the discipline or for our functioning within a broader, scope of social sciences. That has really changed recently, partly because of a new dean, partly because of the huge success that certain administrative measures, again, neoliberal university management is not all bad, that managed to enlarge the number of students that we now have, which means that we are, people regard us now far more self-evidently as legitimate. But that also meant an enormous transformation of the whole institute. I already said that when I joined Patsy as one of the 2 full professors, the 2 jobs that were meant to lead the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology, we were the 2 youngest, except one colleague of mine who was also about a year younger than I am, is still a year younger than I am. All the other people were older. A lot of them were full professors, but not structural positions, but as what they call in Dutch, extraordinary full professors, appointed for a specific purpose. And usually that usually wasn't reflected in, say, their salary level or something like that. It was usually mostly honorary appointment, maybe with some perks such as an extra, research subsidy or something like that with it. But you can imagine that it wasn't easy for two relatively young scholars who moreover were regarded as intrusions from this leftist stuff in Amsterdam into an establishment that was conventionally known as conservative. Of course, Leiden as a university has a somewhat conservative reputation, also because it is always, many times, it was a place where, say, the elite, the Dutch elite, was supposed to be educated, not least the royal family. But of course, the anthropology department was not necessarily like that. Especially not if you think of my predecessor, Peter Geschire, who was as diehard a neo-Marxist as Johannes Fabian and Bob Scholten, my teachers, were. So, but Peter had left and was enjoying himself more at the University of Amsterdam than in Leiden, I think. And so it did take an effort, I think, to begin to get a sense of being at home. And of course, being the two full professors, Patricia and I could really, we're at least sometimes in the position to do something about it, for example, by hiring people that we thought were good, that we liked. So slowly, the composition of the institute shifted, usually hemmed in by the fact that we only had a small number of, relatively small number of students, and could only replace people when someone would retire or leave for another university. There was often not a lot of room to move, but slowly but surely we could do something, and there were other colleagues with whom I could really work well. And I distinctly remember the good experience of working together with Franklin Chonsifat in setting up the BA-MA program when the European legislation on those university programs came through. But it brings me to the whole question of what happened in anthropology, not just in the Netherlands, but also worldwide, in that period that I was actually trying to find my way in Leiden, which, like I said, it wasn't really easy. And maybe one example makes that clear, that at a certain point I had managed to persuade an old student of the Leiden faculty, who had worked with a lot of different people there, but especially with another extraordinary professor, although not appointed in Leiden, of Palestinian descent, who obviously he studied Dutch minorities, so he sort of moved somewhat on the left of the center spectrum of political interest. And this student had become, after quite some interesting work as a journalist in the Middle East, he had become a member of what by then was called Artikel 1. It refers to the first article of the Dutch Constitution that guarantees the equality of citizens and the prohibition on discrimination of people on the basis of race, religion, gender, etc. And he worked at that organization, and I wanted him back into the academy, and we discussed that, and he turned out to be willing, and we managed to do that. And when he arrived, when he was appointed, we were talking together, and it dawned on me in that conversation all of a sudden that we never taught a course on race. While my experience with, the history of anthropology and studying the history of anthropology, I realized that this whole moment of scientific racism is so much tied into the history of the discipline. Right? Even people who didn't believe that there were multiple races of human beings talked race in the same, with the same symbols, with the same categories, with right? And they speculated about what to do about it. And there was always this difference between people with a developmentalist mindset, who thought that people of a certain race would become something else, and people with an essentialist mindset that thought that races were permanent entities and that they wouldn't change. They would always retain the same characteristic. Our students didn't know anything about that. They also didn't know anything about how to relate that to present-day discussions, except what they found out themselves. And I thought it was completely irresponsible that we left the situation like that. So, I think about 5 years after we set up the BAMA program, we started to think about first doing a good course on the anthropology of race and racial classification, and how you should treat that, how you should approach that as an anthropologist. And that mutated slowly into the current course that I'm also teaching, this time with another colleague, although for a long time I did it together with Igor Boch, who was the one I hired, or I persuaded to come into our department. Now I teach it together with another colleague that I was fortunate enough to hire and to be able to put on a tenure track position, Jasmine Rana. We're now teaching a course called Diversity and Power, where we try to teach students not only about race and gender and other forms of diversity, because you can't do everything, but also our sort of critical take on the notion of diversity itself, and the strange byways that diversity management has taken and can take, because it's very often nowadays also part of neoliberal university management, which may have a tendency to say, look, us being diverse, we are good, aren't we? Rather than say, sorry, but we're going to work to make our university even more diverse than it already is, right? So more a commitment to branding by diversity than to becoming more diverse and doing something about social injustice, or social injustices associated with those things. And that's It was a strange moment for me, relatively recently, to reflect back on where I come from, this whole critical anthropological movement, this feeling in the 1990s and early 2000s that we were actually contributing to an anthropology that was reinventing itself successfully. And then after having been immersed for I guess too long a time in the vagaries of university management, sort of coming up for air and realizing where is my critical anthropology, right? I put it somewhere, but I can't find it anymore. Well, obviously I found it fairly quickly once we started thinking along those lines. But there was also a sense of embarrassment and also surprise about how these things can slip through your fingers, or you can be amnesic about those things. That the curriculum that we were teaching was still so much dominated by white male consciousness, you could say, and white male European or North Atlantic consciousness, that it came as a bit of a shock to realize that we should do this differently. This had a lot to do with one thing that I've always said, but in fact couldn't practice for my idea, couldn't practice enough in Leiden. And that is that when I was appointed there, officially as the professor in the Anthropology and Sociology of Modern Africa, I gave an inaugural lecture that says, I regard Africa not as primarily as a continent, or even as a subcontinent, sub-Saharan Africa, which was at that time still largely the topic of all African studies centers, but as a political entity, as a concept, as a classification that has multiple meanings. And if you look at the reference of that word Africa, you realize that in sub-Saharan Africa, it only has a literal geographical meaning when you apply it to the whole continent. But then you should confess that, at least until recently, African studies was not about the northern part of the continent, right? The whole Mediterranean area was largely excluded from it, despite the long-standing historical relationship across the Sahara, or Africa with Egypt, and Libya with Niger, and places like that. And then when you think about what the referent sub-Saharan Africa means, you have to realize that people usually use it as a reference to black Africa. So there was already a sort of color consciousness coming in. Of course, it isn't completely black, but that was the tendency from most African studies scholars. And then there's another sense of Africa, which is transoceanic and particularly transatlantic, with a lot of Africa in the Americas, which had an increasing impact on global relationships, especially in the last 50 years or so. I defined that category as a political intervention rather than as a description of a single referent, and thereby could translate it into projects that relate to what I now call global Africa. So what is Africa globally? It meant that I went into issues like globalization very much, which I also taught in the BA/MA program. But I think the important thing is that, of course, for me, it became the inroad into a focus on problems of diversity that had directly to do with race. And I still teach that part, and I'm trying to figure out how you deal with an increasingly internationalized student population. Right, our current situation in the faculty and in the university is much better because with an international bachelor, which started about 3 years ago, we doubled our student numbers, first-year student numbers. Our master has also increased, partly because we have an extremely successful visual ethnography track with brilliant teachers. Now attracting students. So this whole development has resulted in the fact that the composition of the institute in any case has radically changed. I am now the oldest, I think. Probably, yes. Well, maybe not. There might be one or two competitors, but it's probably that case. I am also relieved of much of my administrative duties, I'm happy to say. Although others who take it up aren't always too happy about the fact that they have to take them up. But it's also the result that I work only 4 days a week, and that was my way of buying myself out of onerous duties that I really didn't feel. I nearly ended up at a certain point with a burnout when I was still, once more scientific director. But I think the more interesting part is what this tells us about the future of anthropology, we see these tendencies that I think I discussed earlier towards collaboration, towards a less individualistic anthropological practice, also in our way of teaching, in the way we discuss doing ethnography with students. What is very important to us is how people realize that ethnography is a social endeavor just as much as the social endeavors of the people that we actually study, and that you define research in social terms as a process of getting acquainted with people, also striking up a relationship that is ethical enough so that they come to trust you to, produce knowledge together with them in ways that that they will rely on, and that they feel they need not question. But that you also remain open to that processual aspect, so that once something changes in that relationship, and you can think here, for example, that the generation of the people that you talk to in your research might not be the generation that follows them, who may have a very other perspective on the kind of knowledge that you generate or have generated. That whole idea of living in a dynamic situation where even from one day to the other your position as a researcher towards your research participants can change because something happens that makes them question the legitimacy of your project, or maybe the other way around, that makes them believe in you more than they ever did, as happened to me when I felt accepted by my research family when the father of the house died, and I joined his funeral. Those kind of processual aspects and collaborative aspects, I think what the future of anthropology spells, and makes it a much less individualistic discipline than it used to be. And I feel that ethos very much around me in the current department, and it makes it a nice place to work, and a place where you regret that the COVID pandemic has disrupted that sense of togetherness, as it has also created new ideas and new practices, but that may be too much for this sequence.